Was not always the case. Back in the day, the red and white we associate with good grooming used to represent blood, bandages, leeches, and pain. As long as people have been making razors of any material, there have been barbers. In Egypt and other ancient cultures as early as 3500 BC, barbers were often priests, whose main job was to keep evil spirits from possessing people. They did this, among other ways, by trimming, styling, and shaving off the hair of the body. This role morphed into something that much more closely resembled a modern-day barber by the time of the Greeks in the 5th century BC. Setting up in an agora, the Greek barber styled hair, trimmed beards, and encouraged gossip. In Rome, barbers were known as tonsores, and many well-groomed Romans made a stop at their shops as part of their daily routine. Even in the extremely misnamed so-called Dark Ages, barbers were in demand. Many monks, like the Benedictines, embraced the tonsura hairstyle, where the crown of the head is shaved with only a narrow ring of hair remaining. Barbers were employed to manage this grooming, and in addition, because of papal prohibitions, barbers were also responsible for conducting Sovereign Council of 1215. They decreed that priests and monks who had a long history of medical and surgical scholarship were forbidden from performing surgeries. Although priests continued to conduct research and serve as physicians for the wealthy, they relied on the barbers for surgical procedures and bloodlettings. In addition to the wealthy, barbers also helped regular people. Lancing boils, setting breaks, pulling teeth, and amputating gangrenous limbs were common procedures, and so too was trepanning, a process by which a hole was drilled in a person's head to reduce pressure on the brain. Surgeries. But perhaps the procedure most commonly associated with barbers in the Middle Ages was bloodletting. Using a narrow blade, the barber would open a vein and allow the blood to pour down into a small brass bowl. By way of advertising, many barbers would display these bowls of blood in their shop window so that people would know that they performed the service. During the procedure, the patient would grip a rod to encourage blood flow, and white strips of bandage would be used to clean the patient. Dirty bandages were washed and hung to dry on the grasping rod outside of the shop. For those wounds too tender or hard to reach, rather than lancing and bloodletting, the barber would apply special leeches known as hirudu medicinals, which emitted a natural anesthetic and an anticoagulant while it sucked blood. These healthy, hungry leeches were typically kept on hand in a separate brass bowl. As for the origin of the famous pole, this is a study in semiotics. It's generally thought that the white on the pole represents the bloodletting rod that was grasped by the patient during the procedure, and the red stripes derive from the bloodied bandages often hung out to dry on the pole after they'd been cleaned as well as possible. As for the rest, things get a little murkier. It's thought that the brass ball at the top may represent the bowl of leeches, while the brass at the bottom evokes the bowl that catches the blood. For those poles that have a blue stripe added, many believe this represents the veins. Of course, sometime in the Middle Ages, the profession of surgeon emerged, and afterwards, surgeons and barbers competed for customers. To end the conflict, Parliament passed and King Henry VIII approved legislation that united both into the Barber Surgeons Company in 1540. Subsequent legislation was passed that further required barbers and surgeons to specialize and distinguish between the two groups by either having a red and white pole for surgeons or one that was blue and white for barbers. So from this, perhaps the blue was simply arbitrarily chosen to represent traditional grooming services. Whatever the case, in 1745 the surgeons split from the barbers and formed the Company of Surgeons that eventually became the Royal College of Surgeons of London in 1800. Barbers as surgeons, rather than just people who groomed hair, gradually fell out of fashion, and it is believed that, for instance, the last barber surgeons in England went the way of the dodo in the early 1800s. Now, let us all face it, we can't all head to the barber every time.